So far, you have been using advanced array methods on arrays of primitive types, such as numbers and strings. We'll now take a look at working with arrays of objects. This is the structure that you will often run into. First, we'll look at creating arrays of objects. So far, you've been used to seeing objects stored as variables like this. This part here, the curly braces and everything inside it, you call that the object literal. It's just the literal value of the object. When you're storing a series of objects inside an array, often you will define the object inside the array using object literals, without assigning each object to its own variable name. Go ahead and type this into your console. It's common practice to give each object in an array of objects a unique ID. That way, even if the array order gets moved around somehow and the object's index number in the array changes, each object still has a unique identifier. Now, let's say that we want to filter for a new array that has only the chocolate-flavored dessert items. But our items are no longer primitives, they're objects, so you can't just say something like this. This will not work. Instead, what we have to do is this. Now, if we check inside Chalk Desserts 2, you can see that it only holds the chocolate-flavored desserts. We'll walk through this. First, we set up a new variable here that will catch the new array that will be returned by the filter. Then after the assignment operator, we put the name of the original array being filtered, then .filter. Then we set up the parameter list for the filter method. And for that parameter list, we passed in this arrow function as the callback function. For this callback function, we are naming this parameter dessert to stand for a single item in the desserts array, just like before we used n to stand for a single number in a numeric array. Then inside the callback function body, we can use that dessert variable. In the first iteration, dessert holds the first item in the array, which is this object with the type of cake and the flavor of chocolate. Then we can check, does this object's flavor property equal chocolate? Yes, so we put it in the new array. Then on the second iteration, we get the second object in the array. We check if its flavor matches chocolate, and it doesn't, so we skip it. Then on the third iteration, this object's flavor does match chocolate, so it goes into the new array. For the next example, I mentioned in the lesson on reduce that when you use reduce with an array of objects, you must include an initial value. We'll look at why that is and how to do it. We can use reduce to total up the cost of every dessert in this array. Let's type it out first in the console, then I'll step us through it. This time, I'll use the parameter names of total for the accumulator value and dessert for the current item value. To set the initial value parameter of a reduce function, we put a comma at the end of the callback function, then follow it with the initial value that we want to use. In this case, we use 0 as our initial value. When we do not set an initial value, then at the first iteration, the accumulator value is automatically set to the value of the first item in the array, and the current value is the value of the second item. That's fine if we're working with primitive values, but in this case, we're working with objects, and we don't want to set the accumulator value, total, to the first item, which is the entire object, because that is not a number. That would mean that we are trying to add this entire object to the cost of the second item. In fact, let's actually try that same reduce without the initial value and see what happens. As you can see, it gives us this weird result. It's trying to concatenate the object and the numbers together, not what we want at all. When we do use an initial value, then reduce acts differently. At the first iteration, it uses the initial value that we gave it as the accumulator value, so that means total equals 0 in the first iteration. Then it uses the first item in the array instead of the second as the current value dessert. That means that the first iteration we're doing 0 plus 450. At the second iteration, total is 450 and dessert.cost is 375. So we add 450 plus 375, which is 825. Finally, for the third and last iteration, the total is 825 and the dessert.cost is 150, so we end up with 975. And that number gets returned into this variable, so our total cost is 975. While the initial value parameter for reduce is required when working with arrays of objects, I want to note that the initial value parameter can also be used with arrays of primitives, such as numbers and strings. It's not only for arrays of objects, but it is required for arrays of objects for the reasons that you've seen, and it's optional otherwise. While we're on the topic of optional parameters, I want to note that both map and filter also have additional optional parameters. And reduce actually has one more optional parameter, which we have not discussed. In fact, many built-in JavaScript methods have optional parameters. But it's outside the scope of this course to go into detail about all the possible optional parameters. If you want to find out more about the optional parameters that we have not discussed, my suggestion is to visit the MDN web docs and look up each method that you're curious about, as the documentation there will typically have a comprehensive list.